Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales About History, and I'm your host, Mike Allen. There are 12 states in this country where you can still find the telephone poles that are painted with red, white, and blue stripes and a large letter L in the middle. It is a sign for the Lincoln Highway. It's a magical roadway, the very first to cross the U.S. coast to coast. It was built more than 100 years ago, but it's making a resurgence in popularity among a trend for nostalgia in the good old days. Well, today we're going to go back in time. We're going to look at the time when the country began to get serious about building highways to connect us with one another, and we're going to hear about how the Lincoln Highway came together. It's an incredible story. And here to tell us this romantic tale of a bygone era is a board member at large for the Lincoln Highway Association in Illinois, Ed Kozak. There are really so many fascinating parts of this story, you'll be amazed. And Ed's a great storyteller. He'll be along in just a moment. This week's trivia question. The question is, when General George Washington signed off on the infamous Culper spy ring, he was in Fredericksburg. Which of the 13 colonies was Fredericksburg located in? Stay tuned after the main program for the answer, because it'll give you the topic for next week's show. Well, undoubtedly, you've heard of Route 66. That's the iconic U.S. highway that stretches from Chicago, Illinois to Santa Monica, California. You may have also heard about the Pacific Coast Highway, or the Grand Army of the Republic Highway. That's U.S. Route 6 between Provincetown, Massachusetts, the very tip of Cape Cod, out to Bishop, California. Or maybe you've heard of the Ethan Allen Highway. That's U.S. Route 7 running from Long Island Sound up to the Canadian border. Now, for the uninitiated, both the original U.S. highway system and the more modern interstate highway system use numbers now instead of those old-time names to mark routes. Even-numbered roads run east to west, and odd-numbered roads run north and south. Now, I love trivia about our old highways and roadways. In fact, I love roads in general, especially ones I've never been on before. Today, we're going to look at perhaps the most significant road ever built in the U.S. It was the very first one to connect the East Coast to the West Coast, the Lincoln Highway, named after, yes, our 16th president. Now, maybe you've heard about it, maybe you haven't, but it is a story well worth your time. It's just as important, just in a different way, as the connection of the coast by rail. Now, that occurred with that famous hammering of the Golden Spike in Promontory, Utah, back in 1869, a few years after the end of the Civil War, and it greatly sped up the development of the West. So when the automobile came along, roads were needed. Very few existed, particularly in between cities. They were really just paths. So in 1912, a proposal was made to build a road stretching 3,000 miles across the country from New York to San Francisco. Here to tell us the fascinating story of how the first transcontinental highway came to be is Ed Kozak. He's a board member at large for the Lincoln Highway Association in Illinois. So, Ed, it is great to have you on the program. People who have listened to my podcast for a while know my old saying of a good day for me is a day when I've been on a road I've never been on before. Roads are the opening to exploration. They take us to all sorts of different places, and we're going to be talking about one heck of a road today. But I want to start off talking about what roads were like at that time when the Lincoln Highway was first envisioned. So they were primarily dirt. Is that correct? And tell me what kind of conditions the earliest motorists and bicyclists faced.
We're going to be fast friends with what you said there. If it's a road that I haven't been on, I'm going on that road. So we should do some exploring in the future for sure. Roads in the past were trails, dirt. They weren't improved. It was just unimproved surfaces that people moved along. And, for a long time, that was okay because it was used for animal purposes, moving animals along trails. People did not really need to move to town that much. They simply wanted to get to railroad stations. So if we had a decent, hard dirt road to get me to the railroad station, that's great because the railroad's going to take me to the next town and maybe to the big city eventually. And there was really no concerted thought to improve roads in America for a long, long time.
Well, one of the things that you said before we started recording that really caught my attention was, in the development of transportation, one of the things that I always routinely leave out, and you just brought up very prominently, and it started this whole movement, was bicyclists. Tell us that story.
Around the turn of the 20th century, bicycle men, that's what they called themselves back then. We'd call them just simply bicyclists. They were the ones that were kind of starting this, what we call good roads movement, because there were no good roads and they were limited in where they could bicycle. They could get up to speeds of 30 miles an hour. Bicycle races were big times. Their velodromes where they would race were big time, and many major cities had them. And so everybody had an interest in bicycles and bicycle racing, but they were limited on what they can do. There was no cross-country tours on bicycles because the roads were impassable at times and barely passable in the best of weather. And so the bicyclists were the pioneers, but something came along after that was much more prominent in American history, the automobile. And the car industry pushed the development of better roads because the more people use their cars more often, the better that the car industry was. And so that was a happy marriage there between everybody involved trying to get America to a better road system.
Now, one person who really saw this was a guy named Carl Fisher, and this is quite an entrepreneur when you think about it. He's from Indiana, and he, in fact, started the Indianapolis Speedway, which, if my research is right, it was the first paved car speedway in the country. But regardless, he's the guy who said, we've done this with the trains. We ought to build a road that goes from New York to San Francisco, transcontinental. And he was the one who started it. And like you said, he turned to the car companies figuring they're the ones who are going to finance this. But he ran into some opposition from a guy named Henry Ford, didn't he?
Indeed. I'd call Carl Fisher a serial entrepreneur guy. If there was a way to make money and something that caught his eye, you bet he was involved with it. He not only was involved with the Lincoln Highway, but he was involved with the Dixie Highway. Now, why did he do a second highway from north to south? Well, it wasn't altruistic that he really wanted, a great road system in that situation. He wanted people to drive down to Miami Beach, where, guess what? Carl Fisher was putting up brand new apartments right on the Atlantic Ocean over there. So, he wanted to make money for himself a little bit, but he did see the light. He did know that, yes, a good road system helps sell headlights, which he initially started, the Presto Light Headlight Company. And so that, believe it or not, cars didn't come equipped with headlights automatically in the early days of automobiles. He and his friends in the auto industry said, well, we got to collect some money. We got to put together maybe $10 million, and that should help us put together a road from New York to San Francisco. And they did very good fundraising. They got it from corporations and individuals, and literally individual people. In other words, just a solicitation of people across America that thought a good road across America was a good idea. And things were going along swimmingly. And he wanted to go after the big tuna. He said, if I can get Henry Ford on board with this will sew it up. We're going to be able to do this and do it on time for our target, which was like 1919, to have this all paved across America. And Henry Ford came along and said, no, thank you. It's something that the government should pay for, not individual people, not individual corporations. But you know what? In the end, it turned out to be a blessing in disguise. After all was said and done, then they did turn their attention to trying to get the national government, state governments to pay for roads and road systems across America. So thank you, Carl Fisher, and thank you, Henry Ford, for probably the better idea on how to raise money for this idea.
Now, also thank you, Henry Joy, because he sort of stepped in where a guy like Henry Ford would not, and he was head of the Packard Motor Car Company, and he ends up sort of taking the reins on this project from Carl Fisher, and isn't he the one who actually came up with the name Lincoln Highway?
Right. He was more of a marketing guy, I guess, in that respect. Carl Fisher had the great name, the Coast to Coast Rock Highway, but not as catchy as a memorial to a beloved president. Henry Joy convinced Carl Fisher, Lincoln Memorial Highway, which was just more commonly known as the Lincoln Highway, would get people on board because of affection for the late president. So, yeah, again, two great minds there, like we said, to form a great highway across America that was the standard for many, many, many other roads that blossomed after that. The Yellowstone Trail, the Victory Highway, the Jefferson Highway, and the Meridian Highway, and the Pacific Coast Highway. All these national named roads sprung up when they saw that the Lincoln Highway was a successful coast-to-coast highway.
Now, one of the stories I love about Henry Joy was he also thought that the road would be much better than the silly marble monument they were going to build in Washington, D.C. to Lincoln, but the Lincoln Memorial's done okay for itself ever since.
Indeed. Every day people would be memorializing Lincoln by driving on his road, for sure.
So now, when the birthday was celebrated for the Lincoln Highway back in 1913, as you said, again, before we started recording, Halloween night of 1913 was the day that everybody celebrated to say we're going to have this Lincoln Highway. It was not a coast-to-coast paved highway that people could just immediately get on and drive simply from one side to the other. Tell us what the conditions were like, particularly when you got west of Geneva, Illinois.
That was a big celebration. You know, it's big news. You can do a lot of newspaper research on this, and you find a town on the Lincoln Highway, and they were celebrating with bonfires and parades and car caravans through town and whatnot. But yeah, in the East Coast, we can generalize and say the roads weren't that bad. They were fairly well maintained and surfaced pretty well, and they would keep a fairly smooth surface. Once you passed into the flatlands of Illinois, Iowa, into Nebraska, there was little or no maintenance and little or no concrete involved whatsoever. They were just rutted roads is the best way to say it. Once it rained in springtime, travel was not advised on the Lincoln Highway because you'd get stuck in the mud. And even sometimes the farmers along the way, they knew that they could, with their horse teams, pull you out of the mud, even when it wasn't muddy, like in the summertime. Some entrepreneurial farmers would wet their roads and make them muddy and then cause certain unsuspecting tourists driving through their little stretch of America, cause them to get stuck, and they'd make 10 or 20 bucks by pulling them out with their horses like that. So most of it was nature made, but some of it was man made, getting stuck in the mud.
Now, one of the biggest shots in the arm for the Lincoln Highway came in 1919 when a famous convoy, a military convoy, was conducted. Will you tell us the backstory of this fascinating story?
Sure. Obviously, 1919, after World War I, American Army and governmental personnel want to find out, hey, what happens, if we get invaded on the East Coast or the West Coast, and we have to move all our material, our trucks, our ammunition, our guns from coast to coast, and get troops over there in large numbers. Can we do it efficiently? Can we do it quickly? Is it even possible? Well, so they tried it. So they went from mile marker 0, what they called the 0 marker in Washington, D.C., up towards Gettysburg, and they followed the most famous road in the country at that time, the Lincoln Highway, and they went all the way west, about 3,000 miles on the Lincoln Highway to San Francisco. Who was assigned to this? Actually, at the last minute. He did not join this Army convoy until he got to Gettysburg, was a young lieutenant in the United States Army, Dwight Eisenhower. He had just gotten married and he was looking for things to do. He was almost ready to leave the Army, but they put him on this convoy. Kind of, they say the rest is history. So he kept a diary, as did other officers who actually had to do formal reports back to Washington, D.C. and Army headquarters about this trip across America with the Army convoy. And the report was not pretty. It was not good. Just like the passengers were finding out, drivers west of Chicago, west of Geneva, Illinois, it's not easy to get across the country, especially when it rains. Most of the bridges did not have the tonnage capacity to carry these heavy-duty Army trucks. It was an eye-opening experience. I think they averaged 4 miles an hour over most of their trip. Sounds like a crawl, but they were expecting much larger miles per hour, but they could not. And they were doing it as a convoy, as a group. Sometimes some trucks would go ahead and wait for them at the evening city, but most of the time they struggled to stay as a unit across the wide open Great American Plain, Utah, Nevada. It was just horrible, unmarked roads and alkali deserts, sand. They were sinking in quicksand. It was it went from bad to worse. And then they had to climb, of course, the Sierra Mountains of California, which didn't help things either. A super big grade to get up. And despite broken down trucks and vehicles and loss of some vehicles, injuries, no loss of life, but injuries to soldiers, like I said, long-term delays. They did make it to San Francisco. And again, we're greeted by the mayor of San Francisco, a group of officials there. A fleet from the Navy was there in the harbor greeting them. It's really eye-opening how bad conditions were in the United States, even on, quote unquote, the best highway in the country, the Lincoln Highway. And it did turn heads, and it changed people's minds because they stopped every night and they were feted. They were giving parties and lunches, dinners as they went through these towns. And part of the marketing arm of this was saying, hey, look, they were supposed to be here at 6 o'clock. They got here at 9 o'clock. Why? Because they got stuck in the mud, because we're not building roads that connect these towns. And what is going to happen if we are invaded? What's going to happen if, we have an ambulance, or what if you need to get to the next town and all of a sudden you can't get to the next town? So it turned people's minds from being very self-centered, and hopefully some of the farmers' minds too, that were trying to kind of hold back and resist against paying money for a road system in their state and in their country. And it was some of the impetus that it got the United States road system, numbered system, in place in 1926, just a few years later.
And let's talk about that for a second, because this directly impacted your association, because this is the one that actually, you go back to Henry Joy, the guy who was the marketing idea, and he started the Lincoln Highway Association, and the association was doing great until this group that I had never heard of before, the American Association of State Highway Officials, were given the remit to do away with all these great romantic road names and replace them with numbers. And that just devastated people along these highways, didn't it?
Yeah, the Lincoln Highway fought it, argued against it, but they saw the handwriting on the wall. You'll see some pictures on the internet, and you come to a telephone pole, and you'll see Lincoln Highway, arrow straight ahead, Jefferson Highway to the right, the Grant Highway to the left, the Victory Highway, follow the Lincoln Highway for a while. Also, don't forget the Lee Highway. That's going to go with you. So you might be following 3 highways on telephone poles, and then you're constantly looking at poles to see if your color sign, Lincoln Highway, was red, white, and blue with an L on it. But if you wanted to follow the Jefferson, it would have a JH for Jefferson Highway on it. And it became ungainly. And there's some terrific pictures out there where, a driver is kind of scratching his head saying, oh, this is one of 8 highways. Which one do I want to take, to get to Sheboygan, or you name the town? And so something had to be done. We the American people and the government had to simplify things, and they certainly did. And to this day, you can drive on that system from 1926. And so that system celebrates 100 years in action here in the United States next year. And there's going to be big celebrations, especially on like Route 66, arguably the most famous road in the country.
As these numbers came in and the Lincoln Highway officially started to fade sort of into the background, September 1st of 1928, you had Boy Scouts fan out 1 per mile across the length. Just tell us what they did.
Some people say 2,000 of these concrete markers, and these were big markers, the majority of which were buried into the ground. If you ever see one up close, you see less than 50% of these markers. They're still in place. They had a medallion, a beautiful bronze medallion of Lincoln, and painted on their Lincoln Highway in our marker right on this concrete post. Now, it's said that they put them in all on one day in early September. Well, maybe. If I think it was an effort over a couple of days period, maybe over a couple of weeks, but nonetheless, they were intrepid, and yes, they were all placed in lines following the last route of the Lincoln Highway that the last generation, as we like to call it, across the country. And the good thing about it is some of them are still in their original place along the highway. And it's always fun to come across a marker, maybe overstrewn with weeds and whatnot. But there are, and the good thing about it is our association has a map and it will pinpoint those places where you can find original Lincoln Highway markers along the route. They picked, I think, a great group to do it with. They, with their adult leaders, did fan out on a day and attempt to put them all into the ground successfully back in 1928.
For about 65 years, the Lincoln Highway Association was more or less defunct, and it was in 1992 that it got revived. And just to let people know, you have an annual conference, you have a website where you sell merchandise, you have all 12 states covered with chapters. I just want to quickly read through those. New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, Nebraska, Wyoming, Utah, Nevada, and of course, California. It's very impressive. And for the last dozen years or so, your wife, Kay, has been the president of this. And tell us how you met her.
Certainly. I had given a tour of Route 66 to a park district in the Chicagoland area. And they said, hey, we loved your tour down the Mother Road, but what else can you do? Give us another tour like that. Let's try something different. And I says, well, I know something that people commonly call the Father Road. It's called the Lincoln Highway. And around Illinois, people commonly refer to it as a Route 30 tour. That's what they wanted. And so I said, you know what? I just joined this association. I just scouted out some great spots to see along the route. Yes, let's do it. So we put that together. We got a bus together in October of 2012. As a cherry on the top, if you will, I saw in my directory of the Lincoln Highway Association that the president lives in DeKalb, Illinois. Yeah, I says, she's probably retired. She's got nothing better to do. I'll have her come and speak to our group, and we're going to meet her at the Egyptian Theater, which is a beautiful theater along the Lincoln Highway. I wonder if she'll be interested in speaking to us. So through some email exchanges, she was very happy to say, yep, I'll be there. I'll help with the tour at the Egyptian, and I'll happily speak to your group as you have lunch there down the street. And so there she was at the Egyptian Theater, opening the door for her, and lo and behold, it wasn't a 70-year-old silver-haired lady, but it was a 45-year-old young woman, just about my age, opening the door for me. And our group loved her, and I loved her too. And we really hit it off. And how about this? 6 years later, we got married. Our love of roads and the love of the Lincoln Highway came together, and we're still happily married to this day. How about that?
That wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales About History. You know, the Lincoln Highway may be the first road to span the U.S., but it is not the longest. That honor belongs to U.S. Route 20, which stretches 3,300 miles from Boston to Newport, Oregon. And the longest interstate highway? Well, that's I-90, 3,100 miles. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Ed Kozak, at-large board member for the Lincoln Highway Association. The answer to this week's trivia question: when General George Washington signed off on the infamous Culper spy ring, he was in Fredericksburg. Which of the 13 colonies was Fredericksburg located in? Well, the answer, it's a bit of a trick question, and I'm sure more than a few of you said Virginia. But Washington was in the colony of New York, in a village that is no longer on the map. Next week on Amazing Tales, the forgotten village of Fredericksburg, New York, where Washington spent 3 months and oversaw several fascinating aspects of the Revolutionary War, not the least of which was approving the start of that consequential spy ring. Amazing Tales About History is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and stay healthy.